In the fall of 1997, 5 cousins gathered for what was supposed to be a quiet weekend reunion at their grandfather's remote lodge in the Texas Hill Country. They were young adults, full of life, full of plans. By Monday morning, they were gone. No footprints, no signs of struggle. The lodge doors locked from the inside, their cars still parked outside. For over 2 decades, families have been haunted by one question. What happened to the 5 cousins of Hollow Creek? If you're new here, subscribe for more stories where the past refuses to stay buried. The lodge sat at the edge of the valley, half swallowed by cedar trees and limestone cliffs. It wasn't much to look at. Cedar plank walls gone gray with weather, a sagging porch swing, and windows that seemed to blink at strangers like tired, suspicious eyes. But to the Halstead family, it had always been the place of return. On that Friday evening in late October 1997, the cousins arrived in separate cars, headlights cutting through dusk as deer scattered off the gravel road. They hadn't all been together in years. Car doors slammed, trunks opened. Laughter, hesitant at first, then freer as the old rhythms returned. There was Thomas, the eldest at 24, steady-voiced and serious, studying law at UT Austin. He was the one who had convinced everyone to meet. He believed a weekend here might bring the family closer after too many years of silence following their grandfather's death. Claire arrived next, her silver sedan rattling up the drive. She was 23, already hardened by working 2 jobs in Dallas, the edges of her voice sharper than she meant them to be. Still, when she saw Thomas waiting on the porch, her arms opened easily. Jacob, only a year younger, carried his guitar case in one hand and a 6-pack in the other. The peacemaker, always filling silence with music or jokes. Then came Elena, small but fierce, her camera swinging around her neck. She was studying photography, intent on documenting everything. Finally, Lily, the youngest at 19. Her car was the loudest, the music thumping as she pulled in. She tumbled out with too much energy, too much recklessness. But that was Lily, the spark none of them could quite control. The 5 of them stood in front of the lodge, staring up at its shadowed windows, as though trying to see the ghost of their grandfather waving from the porch. For a moment, the air seemed too still, the woods too quiet. But then Jacob made a joke about the swing still hanging on with rusty chains, and laughter broke the tension. That night, they built a fire in the great stone hearth, roasting hot dogs, telling stories. Elena filmed parts of it. Shaky, half-lit footage later turned over to police as the last known images. In the video, their faces glow in the firelight. They look impossibly young, unfinished. Hours pass. Voices grow quieter. One by one, they drift to bed. By morning, Hollow Creek was silent again. Neighbors reported no strange cars, no shouting in the night, no broken windows. When the sheriff arrived 2 days later, he found the cousins' cars still there, jackets left on hooks, coffee mugs lined up on the kitchen counter as if someone had just rinsed them. The only anomaly was Elena's camera, left behind on the table. The final frame captured nothing but darkness, a blurred streak of light in the corner, as though the shutter had clicked mid-motion. And then, nothing. For 26 years, that silence has held. Until now. The road into Hollow Creek looked different now. Wider, straight. The ditches were filled with years of gravel, and the old hand-painted mile markers had been replaced with green metal signs stamped by the county. But for Margaret Lane, the drive back into the valley carried the same weight in her chest that it always had. A slow tightening, as though the land itself were holding its breath. She pulled her rental car to the shoulder and cut the engine. For a moment, she just sat there, listening to the tick of cooling metal. The air smelled faintly of cedar and burnt dust. It had been more than 25 years since her cousins vanished. She had been 17 then, too young to join the weekend reunion. Her mother hadn't let her go, saying she was still too much of a child to spend nights drinking with the older ones. Margaret had sulked all weekend. Then Sunday came, and no one came back. Her family's lives fractured that year. Holidays fell silent. The lodge was boarded up. Rumors gnawed at the family name until no one spoke it aloud anymore. Margaret had learned to carry her own silence, to turn the page whenever she felt herself dwelling too long on the missing five. But now, she had been asked to break that silence. The producers from Deep Shadows, a true crime documentary series on YouTube, had reached out 3 months ago. They were planning a season devoted to long unsolved American disappearances, and the Hollow Creek case topped their list. They wanted her perspective, her memories, her insight. At first, she had refused. The thought of cameras digging into wounds left raw for decades made her stomach turn. But something in the producer's voice had unsettled her. "There's new evidence," he'd said, "the kind that could reframe everything." That had been enough to bring her here. Margaret adjusted her glasses and stepped out of the car. The September sun was strong, but the air carried the first bite of autumn. She walked across the gravel shoulder and peered through the trees. Somewhere beyond the cedar wall lay the lodge, still standing, though she had not seen it since she was a girl. A voice broke the quiet. "You Margaret Lane?" She turned. A man was approaching from the opposite car, a beat-up Ford Explorer that bore the faded logo of the Deep Shadows crew. He was tall, thin, his hair tied back. He carried a camera bag slung across his chest. "Yes," Margaret said, squaring her shoulders. "I'm Ryan," he said, extending his hand. "Field producer, thanks for meeting us here." She shook his hand. His palm was warm, steady. "I almost didn't." He gave a half smile. "That's how these usually start." They walked toward the Explorer, where 2 others waited. A young woman with headphones around her neck, and a man leaning against the hood, arms crossed. Margaret recognized him at once from the email signature. Daniel Price, investigative journalist, former print reporter turned documentary host. His voice had narrated countless episodes she'd watched, always with that calm, measured cadence that made even horror feel digestible. Now, in person, he seemed heavier, his hair streaked with gray, his eyes sharp but tired. He stepped forward. "Ms. Lane, I'm grateful you came." "I don't know how much help I'll be," Margaret admitted. "You'll be more than you think," Daniel said. "You lived in the aftermath. That perspective matters." Ryan hoisted his camera. "We're going to start with some B-roll, exterior shots, the road in, establishing mood. Then we'll walk you to the lodge. Just natural conversation. Nothing staged." Margaret swallowed hard. "The lodge is still standing?" Daniel's gaze flicked toward the trees. "Mostly. The county wanted to tear it down years ago, but it fell into dispute. No one claimed ownership after your grandfather's estate dissolved, so it's just been there, waiting." The word hung heavy. Waiting. They moved together down the narrow track. The road bent, dipped, and then opened into a clearing. Margaret stopped dead. There it was. The lodge sagged under the weight of time, its porch collapsed at one corner, its shingles mottled with moss. The windows were empty sockets, some broken, some fogged with grime. The swing still dangled from its rusted chains, one side lower than the other, creaking faintly in the breeze. Margaret's throat tightened. She had dreamed of this place countless times, sometimes bathed in golden light, sometimes crawling with shadows. To see it again in daylight, solid and rotting before her, was like seeing a ghost with skin. Ryan was already circling, camera raised. The young woman uncoiled cables, capturing ambient sound. The creak of branches, the rustle of dry grass. Daniel stood beside Margaret. "Tell me what you see." Her voice wavered. "I see emptiness. I see what's left when life goes missing." He nodded slowly. "And do you believe they're gone for good?" She turned to him. "Don't you?" His eyes lingered on the lodge. I've learned not to believe anything too soon. They entered through the warped front door, stepping into air thick with dust and mildew. The living room stretched before them, its stone hearth blackened, the shelves toppled. A long-forgotten beer can lay crushed in the corner. The place smelled of wet earth and rust. Margaret's stomach churned. She remembered the photographs, her cousins' faces glowing in the firelight. Now the hearth was nothing but ashes and spider webs. Ryan's camera whirred. Daniel moved closer to the hearth, crouching. "Do you know what was found here? The morning after?" he asked. Margaret shook her head. "Nothing," he said. "No broken glass, no overturned furniture, no signs of struggle, just mugs lined up at the sink. A fire burned low in the hearth. It looked as if they had simply stood up and walked out." Margaret shivered. Daniel continued. "But here's what most reports didn't mention. The fire had been started again that morning. Fresh wood, fresh ash. Someone tended it after the time they vanished." Margaret's eyes widened. "You're saying someone stayed, or someone came back?" Daniel said softly. Ryan lowered his camera. The silence pressed in. Margaret's pulse thudded in her ears. She thought of Elena's camera, left behind on the table. She had seen the blurred frame printed in the newspapers, a streak of light, motion, frozen. She had always assumed it was nothing. Now she wasn't sure. Outside, a bird shrieked suddenly. Margaret flinched. Daniel straightened, brushing dust from his hands. "This case has haunted people for decades, but what we're going to uncover, Ms. Lane, may haunt you most of all." The words landed like a weight in her chest. She wanted to tell him she wasn't afraid, but she was. Terribly. And as she glanced once more at the collapsed swing, swaying gently in the breeze, she had the strange, unsettling thought that the house itself was listening. The afternoon light shifted as clouds drew over the valley. The lodge seemed to grow darker inside, its corners swallowing the camera lights no matter how bright they burned. Margaret moved carefully across warped floorboards, her footsteps echoing. Daniel motioned to Ryan to keep filming. "We'll start here," he said. "Natural impressions. Don't force it." Margaret nodded stiffly. She turned toward the living room, her eyes adjusting to the shadows. Dust layered everything. Broken chairs, a warped bookshelf, the outline of where family photos had once hung on the wall. Only faint nail holes remained, like tiny puncture wounds in the cedar paneling. She felt the familiar ache in her chest. "This place was supposed to be safe," she murmured. "It was where we gathered every summer as kids. My grandfather built it with his own hands. And then it became a tomb without bodies." Ryan's camera hummed as he zoomed in. Daniel studied her face. "Do you remember the weekend it happened?" Margaret inhaled. "Yes. I remember being angry. I was 17, the only cousin left behind. My mother said I was too young. I remember sulking, listening to the phone ring and ring on Sunday when no one came home. Then the police came to our door. After that, everything splintered." Her throat tightened. Every family gathering after that was half empty. 5 chairs missing. 5 voices missing. The room fell silent again, except for the distant groan of wood in the rafters. Daniel crouched near the hearth once more, his eyes scanning the stones. "This is what puzzles me. A fire tended. Fresh ash. That suggests presence. Either one of them, alive, or someone else, entirely. Why would that never make it into the official record?" Margaret frowned. "Maybe the sheriff didn't think it mattered. Or maybe someone wanted it buried," Daniel said. The words hung in the musty air. Ryan shifted, lowering his camera slightly. "Dan, you want me to show her?" Daniel's gaze flicked toward him, then back to Margaret. "We weren't going to reveal this so early, but maybe you should see it now." Ryan dug into his bag, pulling out a manila folder. He handed it over. Margaret's fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside was a series of photographs, color slightly faded with age. Each showed the lodge interior as documented by police the morning after. She recognized the details she already knew. The mugs by the sink, the table with Elena's camera left behind, Jacob's guitar leaning against the sofa, but one photograph made her stomach lurch. It showed the entryway, just inside the front door. In the dust along the floorboards were faint marks, elongated shapes, uneven, footprints. Bare. Margaret whispered, "Why? Why weren't these released?" Daniel's voice was quiet. "We only obtained these last year through a retired deputy. They were suppressed from the case file. There was no reason to erase them unless someone didn't want the story told in full." Margaret stared. The prints were small, narrow. "These are a woman's?" Daniel nodded. "Or a girl's. They were never matched." Her skin prickled. She thought of Lily, youngest, always barefoot, always darting outside. Could the prints have been hers? But if so, why cover them up? Her mind spun. Ryan quietly repacked the photos. Daniel rose, brushing dust from his knees. "We'll get more footage tomorrow when the light's better. For now, we'll head back to town. You'll meet someone tonight, the former sheriff's daughter. She has things she wants to say." Margaret followed them out into the afternoon air. The clouds had thickened, making the lodge look darker, more abandoned. She caught one last glimpse of the broken swing. For a fleeting second, she thought it moved too suddenly in the breeze. A sharp jerk, like someone had pushed it. Her heart skipped, but when she looked again, it swayed lazily, as though mocking her imagination. They drove back into town in 2 cars. Margaret followed Daniel's Explorer, the road winding between low hills. She remembered this drive from childhood, the way the land opened into fields, the flash of cattle gates, the sun setting behind scrub oaks. But now every mile carried unease, as if the land itself had swallowed secrets it would not give up. By the time they reached the town square, the sky was dim. Neon signs flickered on above the diner and the gas station. A few trucks lined the curb. Daniel parked outside the diner and waited for Margaret to join him. Inside, the air was heavy with coffee and fried food. A waitress waved them toward a booth at the back. Waiting there was a woman in her 50s, with cropped gray hair and a face lined by years of sun. Her eyes were sharp, restless. Daniel introduced them. "This is Karen Wilkes. Her father was Sheriff Harold Wilkes. He led the investigation." Karen extended her hand. "I'm glad you came, Margaret. I was about your age when it happened. I remember how fast everything went quiet." Margaret shook her hand. "You said you had something to share." Karen leaned forward, lowering her voice. "My father carried that case to his grave. He believed something was wrong from the start. He told me he saw evidence disappear, reports rewritten. The case shut down too quickly. He never said it outright, but I think he suspected. Someone powerful didn't want it solved." Margaret's chest tightened. "Powerful how?" Karen's gaze flicked toward Daniel. "Land deals. Old family money. Your grandfather's lodge wasn't just some cabin. That property was part of a larger tract tied up in inheritance fights. People had reasons to want the cousins gone, or at least to silence talk of what happened." Margaret gripped the edge of the table. "You think they were killed over land?" Karen shook her head. "I don't know, but I do know this. My father told me the last thing he saw before he was pushed off the case. A notebook. One of your cousins had been keeping it. Names, dates, strange entries. He said it vanished before he could log it as evidence." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. "Whose notebook?" Karen's lips thinned. "He wouldn't say. Maybe he didn't know. But he told me this much. Whoever wrote it, they discovered something about the family that was never meant to surface." The words hit Margaret like a cold wave. She thought of Elena's camera, Jacob's guitar, Lily's laughter. And now, a notebook, hidden, stolen. Her voice was faint. "Do you know what was in it?" Karen shook her head. "Number only that my father died certain it mattered." He said, "The kids didn't just vanish. They uncovered something, and that's why they were silenced." Margaret sat back, her heart hammering. The diner's neon buzzed outside. Somewhere across the square, a church bell tolled the hour. For years she had imagined her cousins slipping into darkness, faceless dangers snatching them away. But now, hearing Karen's words, she realized the truth might be darker still. Not strangers, not chance, family. Margaret hadn't planned to see her aunt that night. She had hoped to ease into it. Perhaps after the cameras had gone home, after she'd had time to steady her nerves. But Daniel had insisted. "You'll get truer answers if we approach before word spreads we're digging. People clam up fast when they feel exposed." So now, hours after meeting Karen Wilkes, Margaret sat in the passenger seat of Daniel's Explorer as he drove through the quiet grid of Hollow Creek's neighborhoods. Porch lights glowed faintly. Dogs barked behind fences. Most houses looked the same. Brick ranch style, trimmed hedges, faded flags fluttering on short poles. Her stomach twisted. Aunt Patricia lived in one of them, the last Halstead sibling still in town. She had been Thomas and Claire's mother, and when they vanished, Patricia had become something else too, the voice that refused to speak. "I haven't seen her in years," Margaret said, staring out the window. Daniel kept his eyes on the road. "Do you want to?" "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "She always looked at me like I'd been spared, as if I should have gone instead." The Explorer slowed in front of a house at the end of a cul-de-sac. A single porch light burned. Curtains were drawn. Margaret's pulse quickened. Daniel cut the engine. "If she doesn't want to talk, we leave. No pressure." But Patricia opened the door before they even reached the steps. She stood framed in yellow light, her body thin, her hair gray and loose around her shoulders. Her eyes, the same pale green as Claire's, fixed on Margaret. "You look like your mother," Patricia said. No greeting, no embrace. Just those words. Margaret swallowed. "Hello, Aunt Pat." Patricia's gaze flicked to Daniel, then to Ryan, who had followed with his camera. "You brought them here." "They're helping me understand," Margaret said carefully. Patricia's jaw tightened, but after a long pause, she stepped aside. "Then come in, but I won't perform for that lens." Ryan set the camera down, backing off, while Daniel gestured for Margaret to lead the way. The house smelled of lavender and something older, like mothballs. The furniture was neat, surfaces dusted, but the walls were crowded with photographs. Dozens of framed faces stared out. Family reunions, holiday dinners, children in graduation gowns. Yet the space on the wall where Thomas and Claire's portraits should have hung was empty. Patricia caught Margaret's glance. "I don't display ghosts." They sat at the kitchen table. Patricia folded her hands in front of her, her knuckles swollen with age. She didn't offer coffee or water. She simply looked at Margaret as if measuring whether she would break. "I spoke to Karen Wilkes tonight," Margaret began. Patricia's lips pressed thin. "Gossip." She said the sheriff saw evidence disappear. A notebook, Patricia's eyes flickered, almost imperceptibly. "He told her that?" "Yes." Silence stretched. Margaret could hear the refrigerator hum. Outside, a cicada whined. Patricia's voice, when it came, was low. "Thomas had it. A small leather notebook. He carried it everywhere that weekend, said it was for law school notes, but he wouldn't let me see. Not even Claire. He wrote in it constantly, like he was chasing something down." Margaret leaned forward. "Do you know what was inside?" Patricia shook her head. "Only that he seemed unsettled, restless. He said things like, 'You don't know what Granddad was really involved in,' and 'The land isn't what you think it is.' He frightened Claire with it. She told me she wanted to leave the lodge early, but she didn't. None of them did. Margaret's pulse pounded. Do you think the notebook is why they vanished? Patricia's eyes narrowed. I think people talk too much about mysteries when the truth is simpler. Something terrible happened out there. Maybe an accident. Maybe someone from outside, but people like to imagine secrets. It makes grief easier. Daniel finally spoke, his voice calm. But why suppress evidence, Mrs. Halstead? Why bury a notebook if it didn't matter? Patricia's gaze snapped to him. Because people here protect their own, because land means more than lives in this county. You dig deep enough, you'll see it too, but you won't like what you find. Her words carried a tremor, as though fear ran beneath her anger. Margaret whispered, Do you want the truth, Aunt Pat? Patricia's face softened for the first time. The truth won't bring them back. She looked at Margaret, eyes glistening. But maybe it will take you with them. A long silence settled. Patricia rose, walked to a cabinet, and returned with a small tin box. She placed it on the table. This is all I kept, she said. Margaret opened it. Inside were scraps. A Polaroid of Thomas leaning against the lodge porch, scrawled grocery lists, a movie stub dated 2 weeks before the reunion, and at the bottom, a torn slip of paper, folded and worn. Margaret unfolded it carefully. Written in Thomas's neat hand, October 10th, 1997, Hollow Creek. The ledger exists, hidden in the walls. Margaret stared. Her breath caught. Ledger? Patricia closed the tin. That's all I know, and that's all I'll say. Please, don't come back here. Her voice cracked, but her eyes hardened. The conversation was over. Minutes later, Margaret stepped into the night air, her heart racing. Daniel walked beside her, silent until they reached the car. Then he spoke. A ledger in the walls. That's not grief talking. That's a lead. Margaret clutched her coat. She could still hear Patricia's voice. Maybe it will take you with them. And for the first time since agreeing to this investigation, Margaret wondered if she'd already stepped too far into the dark. The next morning broke with a sharp clarity. Pale light bled over the limestone hills, setting the cedar tips glowing silver. Margaret hadn't slept. Patricia's warning had replayed endlessly in her head. The truth won't bring them back. Maybe it will take you with them. She'd considered leaving Hollow Creek altogether, packing her bag, driving to the airport, and letting the past rot where it lay. But when she looked at the torn note again, Thomas's handwriting curling across the page, she felt him pulling her forward. The ledger exists, hidden in the walls. She couldn't walk away now. Daniel picked her up just after 7. Ryan drove the Explorer this time, with camera cases stacked in the back. The air inside smelled faintly of burnt coffee. Daniel glanced at her. You didn't sleep. Margaret shook her head. That might help, he said. The tired mind notices things the trained eye misses. They reached the lodge as the sun climbed higher. Dew clung to the grass, sparkling around the sagging porch. From a distance, it looked almost beautiful, a trick of light disguising rot. Margaret hesitated at the threshold. The memory of the photographs pressed in. Bare footprints, blurred images, the final ash in the hearth. Now they were here to peel back the walls themselves. Ryan set up 2 cameras on tripods to cover wide angles. He adjusted the levels, then gave Daniel a nod. Daniel pushed open the door. All right. Let's see if Thomas was right. Inside, the air was still heavy, but brighter than yesterday. Shafts of sunlight broke through cracked shutters, illuminating dust motes that swirled in slow motion. Daniel carried a small crowbar. Ryan had packed gloves, flashlights, and a metal detector wand. Margaret brought only her trembling hands. They started with the living room. Daniel moved along the cedar paneling, tapping methodically. Each knock echoed hollow, then solid, then hollow again. The sound seemed to pulse in Margaret's chest. At the far wall, beneath a crooked window, Daniel paused. He tapped again. The thud rang oddly, muffled, as if something more than insulation lay behind it. "Here," he said. Ryan moved in, camera focused. Daniel wedged the crowbar into a seam between boards and pulled. The wood groaned, then splintered free, releasing a puff of stale dust. Behind it, darkness. Then, faintly, the edge of a wooden box. Margaret's breath caught. Daniel reached in, dragging the box forward. It was small, about the size of a shoebox, its surface blackened with mold, its brass latch corroded. "This could be it," Daniel whispered. Margaret's pulse thundered. She reached for the latch, but Daniel stopped her. "Gloves first. If this is evidence, we preserve it." He pulled on latex gloves and carefully pried open the box. Hinges squealed. Inside lay a stack of papers, brittle, stained, edges curling. On top sat a leather-bound book, its cover cracked, initials embossed faintly. J.H. Margaret's voice trembled. "Jim Halstead, my grandfather." Daniel lifted the book gently. Dust cascaded. The spine threatened to crumble. He opened to the first page. Rows of numbers. Dates. Transactions written in Jim Halstead's neat hand. Columns of cash amounts alongside initials Margaret didn't recognize. Some entries were circled in red ink. Others were crossed out entirely. "This isn't just a ledger," Daniel murmured. "It's a record of dealings. Payments, maybe bribes, names hidden in initials. And look here." He turned a page. Scrawled in darker ink, not her grandfather's hand, were words that made Margaret's stomach twist. "They know. Stop using the lodge. Too many eyes. Burn the rest." Her voice was barely audible. "Who wrote that?" Daniel shook his head. "Could be Thomas, could be someone else." Ryan zoomed in, capturing every detail. The pages crackled like fragile skin. Margaret flipped further. More numbers. Then a list of parcels of land, acreages, coordinates, and beside them, strange notations. Water rights, deep sink, no record. One phrase repeated 3 times, underlined. Hollow Creek, stay quiet. Margaret's hands shook. He was hiding something here, something tied to the land. Daniel nodded grimly, and Thomas must have found it. The sound of the wind outside deepened suddenly, as though the trees had shifted closer. Margaret turned sharply toward the broken window. For an instant, she thought she saw movement among the cedars, a dark shape retreating into shadow. Her skin prickled. "Did you see that?" Ryan lowered the camera. "What?" "Someone out there," Margaret whispered. They stood still, listening. Only silence, heavy and unmoving. Daniel closed the ledger carefully and returned it to the box. "We'll take this back to town. Digitize it. The less time it spends here, the better." As they carried the box toward the door, Margaret glanced back once more. The empty hearth. The crooked swing visible through the window. For the first time she felt certain. The lodge wasn't just the site of a disappearance. It was the center of something larger, something her grandfather had written down, something Thomas had uncovered. And someone, somewhere, had been watching them just now. When they reached the Explorer, Ryan strapped the box carefully into a case. Margaret looked once more at the tree line. The wind had stilled. The branches hung motionless. But the feeling of being seen lingered like a weight on her back as they drove away. The Hollow Creek Library was small, a single-story brick building with narrow windows and a copper roof dulled green by rain. Inside, though, it carried the hushed weight of history. Rows of county records filled the back room, stacked in heavy binders and brittle manila folders. Daniel had secured permission from the archivist to work at one of the large oak tables. Ryan arranged cameras discreetly, their red recording lights faint against the lamplight. The ledger box sat in the center, sealed inside a clear plastic sleeve. Margaret's hands itched to touch it again, but she forced herself still. She had not stopped thinking about the scrawled warning inside. Stop using the lodge. Too many eyes. Burn the rest. Daniel pulled on gloves, opened the box, and set the ledger gently on the table. The air filled with a faint smell of mildew and ink. "Okay," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "Let's start decoding." The first entries were dated in the late 70s. Columns of cash amounts, large sums far beyond the reach of an ordinary dentist like Jim Halstead had been. Initials accompanied each line: HB, CK, JR. Ryan leaned closer, camera focused on the faded ink. "These initials mean anything to you?" Margaret shook her head. "Not yet." Daniel flipped further. More transactions, growing larger as the years passed. Then, in the margins, one notation: HC Well, number 3, $12,000 cash. CK. Margaret frowned. HC, Hollow Creek? Daniel nodded slowly. And Wells. That could mean water rights, drilling, maybe even oil. These aren't casual notes. This ledger is tracking money through land. They checked the parcels list again. Coordinates scribbled beside acreages. Words like deep sink and no record. Margaret whispered, "Sinkholes." Daniel looked at her. "This land is riddled with limestone sinkholes. My cousins and I used to play near one as kids. We were told never to get too close. If someone wanted to hide something, anything, those would be the places." Her voice faltered. "Even bodies." The word hung in the air. Daniel exhaled slowly. Thomas must have pieced this together. He saw his grandfather's clean public face: dentist, lodge builder, family man. And then he found this: money, land, unrecorded wells. He started connecting dots, and then he vanished. Margaret pressed her palms together. "You think he was silenced?" Daniel didn't answer. His silence was enough. Ryan closed the box carefully, sealing it again. "We'll need to cross-reference county deeds. See which parcels Jim Halstead owned. See who bought them later." The archivist, a soft-spoken woman with round glasses, approached with a stack of records. "I pulled these based on the dates you gave me. Halstead properties, transfers, and disputed claims." They spent the next hours sifting through brittle pages. Margaret's eyes blurred with ink and paper, but she began to notice patterns. The same initials appeared repeatedly: HB, CK, JR, across property deeds and water rights transfers. One name finally crystallized: Charles Carnes. His signature sprawled across multiple documents, tied to wells and land purchases. Daniel tapped the name with his gloved finger. C.K. Carnes, same initials from the ledger. This man received money from your grandfather. He acquired land around Hollow Creek, and he's still alive. County records show he owns property 20 miles out, near the river. Margaret felt her stomach twist. I've heard that name, Carnes. He was at family gatherings sometimes, a friend of my grandfather's. Always kept to himself, but I remember his laugh. Too loud, too forced. She remembered something else. Patricia once telling Claire to stay away from Charlie. Daniel scribbled notes. So here we have a direct line. Jim Halstead paying Carnes, properties linked to sinkholes, and Thomas sniffing it out. Then 5 cousins vanish. That's not coincidence. Margaret rubbed her temples. It means my grandfather was involved. Silence followed. She looked up, her voice cracking. My grandfather, who gave us Christmas, who built the lodge for us to gather. He was paying off land deals that may have gotten his grandchildren killed. Daniel's expression softened, but he didn't refute her. People are never just one thing, Margaret. The face they show at the dinner table and the face they wear when money's at stake can be different creatures. Margaret closed her eyes. For the first time, she felt shame. Not just grief, but a twisting shame that her bloodline might be soaked in corruption. The clock above the desk ticked loudly. Ryan cleared his throat. We need to consider what the warning note meant. Burn the rest. If some of these records were destroyed, this ledger might be the only surviving evidence of whatever operation was going on. And if someone risked hiding it in the lodge instead of burning it, maybe they wanted it found someday. Margaret opened her eyes, clinging to that thought. Maybe Thomas hid it. Or maybe someone else, Daniel said grimly. Someone who knew this day would come. The library's fluorescent lights flickered. A storm gathered outside, thunder low and distant. Daniel closed the ledger, sealing it back into the box. We're done here for now. Next step is finding Carnes. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. You think he's connected? I think he never left this place for a reason, Daniel said. And if your grandfather trusted him, then Carnes knows more than anyone else still alive. Thunder cracked sharply, rattling the windows. Margaret flinched. For a moment she thought of the tree line by the lodge, the shadow she'd glimpsed. It was as if Hollow Creek itself had ears. That night, back in her motel, Margaret couldn't sleep again. She sat at the desk, staring at Thomas's torn note. The ledger exists, hidden in the walls. He had been right. He had left her a trail. But what terrified her most was what came next. Following the trail beyond blood, beyond silence, to a man whose name now echoed in her mind with dread. Charles Carnes. And the sudden chilling thought that maybe, just maybe, one of her cousins hadn't died at all, but had been forced into Carnes's shadow. The road to Carnes's property wound along the river, a two-lane strip of cracked asphalt that narrowed the farther they went. The landscape grew rougher here. Cedar thickets, rusted barbed wire fences, cattle gates leaning at crooked angles. The clouds that had gathered the night before still clung low, pressing the sky into a dim ceiling. Margaret sat stiffly in the passenger seat, staring at the land sliding past. Each mile felt like a descent into something she couldn't name. Daniel drove in silence, one hand on the wheel, the other tapping a rhythm against his thigh. Ryan followed in the Explorer with the equipment, far enough back to be discreet. Margaret broke the silence. I keep wondering what my grandfather would say. If he'd deny it all. If he'd look me in the eye and call me crazy. Daniel's gaze stayed fixed on the road. Or maybe he'd just say nothing. Silence is its own kind of guilt. They passed a sagging billboard. Carnes Ranch. Private property. The paint was flaked, the letters fading. Margaret's stomach knotted. He's expecting us. I left word, Daniel said. Didn't say why, just that we wanted to talk. Margaret turned to him. And if he refuses? Daniel's jaw tightened. Then we film him refusing. The road ended at a rusted cattle gate strung with chain. Beyond it stretched a wide pasture, grass gone to seed, scattered with rusting equipment. A house stood far back, 2 stories of gray clapboard, its windows dark. A barn leaned to one side like a weary sentinel. An old pickup was parked by the house. Daniel got out, unchained the gate, and drove through. The gravel cracked under the tires as they approached the house. Margaret's pulse pounded. Every instinct told her to turn back. But she forced herself to stay seated, hands gripping her knees. The front porch sagged under Daniel's boots as he climbed the steps. He knocked firmly. Margaret stood behind him, her heart hammering. For a long moment, nothing. Then the door opened. Charles Carnes filled the doorway. He was older now, late 70s maybe, but still broad, shoulders thick under a faded flannel shirt. His hair was white, cropped close, his jaw shadowed with stubble. His eyes were pale blue, piercing but dulled with something Margaret couldn't name. Daniel Pierce, he said, voice gravelly. You've been sniffing around. Daniel extended his hand. Carnes didn't take it. This is Margaret Halstead, Daniel said. She's Thomas's cousin. Carnes's gaze shifted to her. For a heartbeat, Margaret thought she saw recognition flash. But whether it was pity, guilt, or something darker, she couldn't tell. "You look like your mother," he said, echoing Patricia's words. Margaret stiffened. "You knew my grandfather." "I knew Jim." Carnes leaned against the doorframe. "Everybody knew Jim." Daniel kept his voice calm. "We'd like to ask about the ledger." A flicker. Carnes's jaw worked. "Ledger?" "The one your initials are all over," Daniel pressed. "Transactions, wells, land, all tied to Hollow Creek." Carnes's expression didn't change, but his hand gripped the doorframe tighter. "Don't know what you're talking about." Margaret's voice broke the silence. "My cousins disappeared. 5 children, 16 years, and your name was in his book." Carnes' pale eyes locked onto hers. "That book should have burned with the rest." The words fell heavy. Margaret's breath caught. Daniel leaned in slightly. "So it exists, then?" Carnes' face hardened. For a moment, Margaret thought he might slam the door. But then he stepped back. "Come in. If you're gonna stir ghosts, might as well hear how they died." The house smelled of stale tobacco and dust. Curtains blocked most of the light. Papers and boxes cluttered the living room, stacks leaning precariously. A rifle rested above the mantel. Carnes lowered himself into a chair, joints creaking. He gestured for them to sit. Daniel kept his camera bag close, though he didn't pull it out yet. Margaret perched on the edge of the sofa, unable to steady her hands. Carnes studied them. Jim was smart, too smart. He knew where the money was, not in teeth, not in patience, but in the ground, water, minerals, land. He made deals that needed grease. That ledger you found, it was just numbers. Didn't show what really mattered. Margaret swallowed. And what really mattered? Carnes leaned forward. His breath smelled of smoke. Where things were buried, where you could hide what you didn't want found. Margaret's chest tightened. Bodies? Carnes' eyes glittered. Sometimes just records. Sometimes both. Daniel's voice stayed calm, though Margaret heard tension in it. You're saying your deals with Jim Halstead involved hiding things? Carnes leaned back, a cruel smile tugging his lips. I'm saying this county was built on secrets, and your family was no different than the rest. Maybe worse. Margaret's hands balled into fists. What happened to my cousins? The old man's smile faded. He looked at her for a long, unbearable moment. Then he said, quietly, Some secrets rot where they're buried. Dig too deep, you'll just choke on them. The air seemed to thicken. Thunder rolled distantly outside. Daniel finally pulled the camera from his bag, lens clicking. Say that again, Mr. Carnes, on record. But Carnes's eyes had already shifted to the window. His jaw tightened. You need to leave. Now. A silence fell. Margaret glanced over her shoulder, suddenly aware of movement outside. A figure near the barn, half hidden, watching. Her stomach dropped. Daniel stood, camera still rolling. We're not done. Yes, you are, Carnes growled. Next time, you'll be trespassing. They stepped out onto the porch. Rain had begun to fall, spattering the dirt. Margaret looked toward the barn again, but the figure was gone. As they reached the truck, Daniel whispered, He admitted more than he meant. Ledger, burials, your family's involvement. Margaret pulled her coat tighter, shivering, but her eyes were fixed on the barn, because for the briefest moment, before the figure vanished, she thought she recognized something impossible. A face. A cousin's face. Margaret didn't remember the drive back into town. She must have been awake. Her hands still hurt from clenching the seatbelt, her throat raw from holding words she couldn't say. But the road blurred into a gray smear. When Daniel finally pulled into the motel parking lot, she startled as if waking from a dream. Get some sleep, he told her. His voice was steady, calm, too calm. She nodded automatically, though sleep felt impossible. Inside her room, she paced. The beige walls seemed to lean closer. The thin curtains, drawn tight, whispered against each other as though stirred by unseen breath. Every sound outside, footsteps, a car door, the hum of the vending machine, landed like a threat. But what tormented her most was the memory of that fleeting glimpse by Karn's barn. A face, thin, pale, familiar. She tried to force herself rational. The mind invents shapes in shadow. You were tired. You were frightened. You wanted to see someone. Anyone. But the more she replayed it, the more certain she became it wasn't invention. It was recognition. A cousin. She pressed her palms to her eyes until colors bloomed. When she dropped them, the room swam. By midnight, she gave up on rest. She spread Thomas's torn note, the photocopies of the ledger pages, and the county records across the motel desk. Her fingers traced the ink like braille, as if by touch alone she could force them to speak. Hidden in the walls. Hollow Creek. Stay quiet. Burn the rest. Her grandfather's handwriting. Then another scrawl layered across it, almost violent. They know. Who was they? She flinched at a knock on her door. Heart hammering, she looked through the peephole. Daniel. She opened the door, relief flooding and then receding almost instantly. "You're still up," he said. "So are you." He stepped inside, eyeing the papers. "You shouldn't be doing this alone." Margaret's laugh cracked. "Isn't that what I've always been doing? 16 years of silence, 16 years of birthdays with an empty chair. Of course I do it alone." Daniel closed the door gently. "You saw someone today." Margaret froze. "What?" "You've been spiraling since we left Carnes's place. I know the look. You saw something you can't reconcile." Her throat closed. She wanted to lie, to say she'd just been tired. But the words pushed through. "I saw a face," she whispered. "By the barn. I think it was one of them." Daniel studied her carefully, expression unreadable. "Which one?" Margaret shook her head violently. "I don't know. I only saw a flash. But it was there. Don't tell me I imagined it." Daniel sat on the edge of the bed. "I'm not telling you that. I'm telling you that sometimes trauma fills gaps with ghosts. I've seen victims swear they recognized someone long dead." "It wasn't a ghost." Margaret's voice sharpened. "What if at least one of them lived? What if Carnes—" She broke off, swallowing bile. "What if he kept one of them?" The silence that followed was unbearable. Daniel finally spoke. "Then we need to know." Margaret leaned across the desk. "Stake out the property, cameras, night vision, catch him if he's hiding someone." Daniel didn't move. "That's not a documentary play. That's law enforcement territory." "Law enforcement ignored this for 16 years, Margaret snapped. "They let evidence vanish. They let my cousins disappear into a file cabinet. I won't wait another year, another day. We saw something today." Her voice cracked on the word saw. She pressed her hands against her temples, fighting the throb. Daniel exhaled slowly. "If we stake him out, we do it right. No trespassing, no direct confrontation, cameras from the road, motion sensors if Ryan can rig them. But Margaret," his tone softened, "you need to understand something. If Carnes is hiding someone, if your cousin has been alive in that barn all this time, what state do you think they'll be in?" Margaret's stomach twisted. Images flooded, a figure pale from years indoors, eyes sunken, voice lost. A shell. "Still," she whispered, "alive is better than gone." Daniel nodded once. "Then we prepare. Tomorrow." He gathered a few of the scattered papers into neat stacks, as if the act could restore order. "Try to rest." When he left, Margaret sat in the dim motel light, staring at the ledger copies. On one page, she noticed something she had missed before. A set of initials repeated 3 times in 1996. MC. The amounts beside them were smaller than the others, almost like allowances. Her hand trembled as she traced them. Micah Carraway. She remembered the name suddenly, an old ranch hand who used to drink with Carnes, who once fixed the lodge's generator. She had heard Patricia mention him years ago. The ledger linked not only Carnes but others. And if Carnes still had company at that property, maybe Micah was part of it. Margaret's throat tightened. Tomorrow couldn't come fast enough. She lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling until dawn. The last thought before sleep finally dragged her under was a question she couldn't silence. What if the face she'd seen wasn't one of the cousins at all, but someone who wanted her to think it was? Ryan's Explorer rolled quietly onto the gravel shoulder 1/2 mile from Carnes' property. The sun had gone down an hour earlier, leaving only the pale afterglow bleeding into the western sky. Clouds dragged across the moon, breaking its light into fragments. They killed the headlights and coasted to a stop. The house and barn were just visible in the distance, faint outlines against the fields. Margaret hugged her coat tighter. The cold was sharper tonight, cutting through the thin motel fabric. Her nerves felt exposed, every sound amplified. The tick of cooling metal, the faint whine of cicadas, the rasp of her own breath. Ryan opened the back, pulling out cases of gear. Small infrared cameras, a parabolic microphone, 2 motion sensors. He handled them with the quiet efficiency of practice. Daniel leaned in close to Margaret. "We stay outside the property line, cameras hidden along the fence. One on the barn, one covering the back of the house. No lights, no noise. If we see activity, we record and pull out." Margaret nodded, though her throat was dry. "And if we see someone?" "Then we have evidence," Daniel said. "Nothing more tonight." They moved slowly through the thickets along the fence line. The grass was damp, soaking Margaret's shoes. The barn loomed across the field, its roof sagging, a pale strip of moonlight catching the tin. Ryan planted the first camera against a cedar trunk, its infrared lens glowing faintly before vanishing into darkness. He adjusted its angle toward the barn. The second camera went up along a fence post, aimed at the rear of the house. Margaret crouched, hugging her knees, watching the house lights. Only one room glowed faintly yellow. The living room, where Carnes had spoken to them earlier. His silhouette shifted occasionally across the curtain. She whispered, "He's awake." Daniel crouched beside her. "Good. If he's busy in there, he's not outside." They settled in a shallow ditch near the fence, blankets spread over the cold ground. The parabolic microphone pointed toward the barn. Minutes stretched, the night filled with ordinary sounds. Owls, coyotes, the distant rush of the river. Margaret's body began to ache from stillness. Her thoughts chased each other in circles. Every creak of the barn became a possibility. Every shadow might be a figure. After nearly an hour, Ryan nudged the microphone. A faint sound bled through the headphones. He passed them to Daniel. Daniel listened, brow furrowing. Then he handed them to Margaret. Her heart hammered as she pressed them over her ears. At first, only static. Then, faint, almost swallowed by the night. A rhythm, breathing, shallow, uneven, coming from the barn. She pulled the headphones off, her chest tight. "There's someone in there." Daniel's jaw clenched. "Could be an animal." "It's not." Margaret's voice trembled. "I know what breathing sounds like. That was human." Ryan checked the camera monitor. The barn sat still, no visible movement. But the microphone picked it up again, faint gasps, then silence. Margaret dug her nails into her palms. "We can't just sit here," Daniel whispered sharply. "We're not rushing in blind. We don't know who's in there, or if it's a trap." They waited. Another hour. The breathing came and went, sometimes clear, sometimes gone as if muffled. At one point, Margaret thought she heard something else. A faint metallic scrape, like chains dragging. Her stomach turned. "He's keeping someone in there." Daniel didn't answer. Near midnight, the light in the house went dark. Carnes' silhouette disappeared. The property sank into blackness. Ryan adjusted the infrared feed. A faint blur appeared near the barn door. Margaret leaned close, breath fogging. A figure, thin, stooped, moving slowly. Margaret's chest seized. That's them. That's one of them. The figure staggered a few steps into the yard, paused, then looked toward the house. Even through the grainy feed, Margaret could see hair hanging long, features obscured but human. She pressed her hand against her mouth to stifle a sob. The figure turned as if listening, then retreated quickly into the barn. The door closed. Ryan exhaled sharply. Got it on camera. Margaret grabbed Daniel's arm. You saw. Tell me you saw. His face was pale in the moonlight. I saw. Her pulse raced so hard it hurt. Then it's true. One of them survived. Daniel placed a steady hand on her shoulder. Now we take this to the sheriff. Hard evidence. No one can ignore this. But Margaret's eyes stayed locked on the barn, her nails digging into her palms. Because something in the way the figure moved, the stoop, the falter, made her certain it wasn't just a stranger. It was Claire, the cousin she had once shared every secret with. And if Claire was alive, then everything Margaret had believed about that night 16 years ago was a lie. The sheriff's office sat on the corner of Main and Ash, a squat brick building with faded lettering and a flag that hung limp in the morning heat. Margaret had not stepped inside in over 2 decades. The last time she'd been here, she was a child, clutching Patricia's hand as deputies asked her to describe what she remembered of the night the cousins vanished. She remembered the feel of Patricia's fingernails digging into her skin. She remembered the unspoken command in her aunt's eyes. Say nothing. Now, as she crossed the threshold again, the air felt the same, heavy with the odor of coffee and old paper, the hum of fluorescent lights. Daniel carried the laptop bag with the footage. Ryan followed with the camera, already filming. Margaret tried to steady her breath. At the counter sat Sheriff Claiborne. He was older now, heavier around the middle, his hair gray at the temples, but his presence was unchanged. A man rooted in this soil, immovable, patient as stone. He looked up with mild irritation that sharpened when he saw the camera. Mr. Pierce, he said flatly, you've been busy. Daniel kept his tone even. We need to show you something. Evidence. Claiborne gestured toward his office with a curt wave. Let's not make a circus out here. Inside, the blinds were half drawn, casting stripes of shadow across the desk. Claiborne sat behind it, folding his hands, waiting. Daniel opened the laptop and cued the footage. The barn filled the screen, infrared glow turning it ghostly. Then the figure appeared, thin, stooped, stepping into the yard. Margaret's breath caught even though she had watched it a dozen times. Ryan zoomed in, freezing the frame as the figure turned, the outline of long hair, the fragile tilt of the head. Human, Daniel said quietly. On Charles Carnes' property. At midnight, silence filled the room. Claiborne leaned back, his face unreadable. Could be a drifter, could be one of Carnes' ranch hands. Margaret's voice broke. That's not a ranch hand. That's Claire, my cousin. Claiborne's eyes flicked to her, then back to the screen. You're certain, after 16 years? I know her, Margaret snapped. The way she moves, the way she holds her shoulders, that's Claire. Claiborne exhaled slowly. You trespassed. Daniel's jaw tightened. We did not cross his property line. Cameras were on public land. Still looks like harassment, Claiborne said. His gaze shifted to the camera recording him. And intimidation. Ryan lowered the lens slightly but didn't turn it off. Margaret leaned forward, her hands trembling. You can't ignore this. My cousins vanished. You let the case go cold, and now you have proof one of them is alive. What more do you need? Claiborne's face hardened. What I need is something admissible. Grainy night footage of a shadow doesn't hold up in court, and Carnes is a landowner, taxpayer, respected here. I can't kick down his barn door because you want ghosts resurrected. Margaret's throat burned. Respected? He was in the ledger. My grandfather's ledger. Do you know what that means? The sheriff's eyes narrowed. I know your grandfather built half this county, and I know slandering his name won't help you. The words landed like a slap. Daniel closed the laptop with a snap. So you'll do nothing. I'll look into it, Claiborne said flatly. That's all I can promise. Margaret felt something inside her crack. 16 years you've promised. 16 years you've let them rot. For the first time, Claiborne's expression shifted. A shadow flickered across his eyes. Anger or fear. His voice dropped. Careful, Margaret. Digging too deep into the past can bury you too. Daniel stood, bag in hand. We'll find the truth with or without your badge. They left the office. Margaret's legs shook so badly, Daniel had to steady her as they reached the truck. Ryan climbed in, slamming the door. He's covering. You saw it in his face. Margaret pressed her hands to her mouth, trying to breathe. The sheriff's warning echoed in her head. Bury you too. Her eyes blurred with tears. He knows. Daniel started the engine. Then he's afraid. Fear means leverage. We keep pushing. Margaret nodded faintly, but her heart pounded with a deeper realization. If the sheriff was complicit, if he had been shielding Carnes and her grandfather all these years, then Claire's survival wasn't a miracle. It was a sentence. And the clock was still ticking. The motel room smelled of stale coffee and nerves. Margaret sat on the bed, hands locked around her knees, staring at the footage looping on Daniel's laptop. Claire's blurred figure staggered across the screen again and again, retreating into the barn. Her cousin, alive, and the sheriff dismissing it, warning her off. She whispered, If we wait for them, she'll vanish again, just like before. Daniel paced near the window, blinds drawn tight. Breaking in is reckless. Carnes is armed. If he catches us... Margaret's eyes burned. He already caught her. He's had her 16 years, and the sheriff will bury this. You saw his face. We can't wait. Silence thickened. Rain ticked faintly against the window. Ryan sat cross-legged on the floor, cleaning a lens with slow, deliberate motions. Finally, Daniel stopped pacing. His shoulders sagged as though the fight drained from him. If we do this, we do it quiet. No lights, no sound. One shot. If she's in there, we get her out. If she's not... He didn't finish. Margaret exhaled sharply. Relief and terror knotted together. By midnight, they were back in the ditch along the fence line. The barn loomed darker than the sky, roof gleaming faintly with rain. The house sat silent, its windows black. Ryan whispered, No movement on the cameras. He's asleep. Daniel scanned the field with binoculars. We go now. They slipped under the fence, moving low through the wet grass. Each step seemed thunderous to Margaret's ears, though the night swallowed the sound. Her breath puffed white in the cold. At the barn wall, the wood smelled of mildew and rot. A rusted padlock hung from the main doors. Daniel pulled a small pry bar from his bag, wedging it carefully until the lock popped with a dull snap. The sound seemed to echo forever. They froze. Nothing stirred. Daniel eased the door just wide enough to slip through. Inside, the air was heavy with dust, manure, and something sharper, the metallic tang of rust or blood. Moonlight filtered through gaps in the roof, striping the hay-strewn floor. Shapes loomed, rusted tools, feed bins, a broken plow. Margaret's pulse hammered so hard she thought it would give them away. They moved deeper, the beam of Daniel's small infrared scope cutting a narrow path. Each shadow seemed alive, breathing. Then Margaret heard it. A faint rattle. Chain against wood. Her throat tightened. Claire, she whispered before she could stop herself. The sound stopped. Then, from the far stall, the faintest whimper. Margaret surged forward, but Daniel caught her arm. Quiet! They edged to the stall. Daniel lifted the beam over the half-rotted door. A figure huddled in the corner, Margaret's knees nearly buckled, thin limbs, bare feet pale against the dirt, long hair hanging in tangled ropes, eyes wide, reflecting the beam like an animal's. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth. "Claire." The figure flinched at the name. Daniel knelt, voice low, steady. "We're here to help. We're not him. You're safe." The girl stirred, chains clinking. Around her ankle gleamed a shackle, iron biting into the skin. Margaret's vision blurred. 16 years. All the birthdays, the Christmases, the long empty nights, here, alive in rust and shadow. She reached a trembling hand through the stall bars. "It's me, Margaret. Do you remember?" The girl's lips parted. A dry whisper escaped. "Don't." Trapped Daniel froze. "What?" The barn door slammed open behind them. A flood of white light poured in, blinding. Margaret spun, eyes seared. A silhouette filled the doorway. Broad shoulders, rifle in hand. Charles Carnes. His voice was a low growl. "You should have listened to the sheriff," the girl shrieked, curling into the corner. Daniel raised his hand slowly, shielding Margaret with his body. Ryan fumbled for the camera, but the light washed everything out. Margaret's heart hammered. They were caught. No escape. Carnes stepped inside, the barrel of the rifle gleaming. "You want secrets?" His pale eyes fixed on Margaret. "Then die with them." The white light seared Margaret's eyes, shrinking the barn to a cage of glare and shadow. Her ears roared with her own heartbeat. But beneath it she caught the creak of Carnes's boots on the warped boards, steady and deliberate. The rifle never wavered. Its black mouth seemed to breathe with her. Daniel's voice cut through the silence, low but firm. "You don't want to do this." Carnes barked a laugh. "Boy, I've been doing this longer than you've been alive." He shifted his aim from Daniel to Margaret. "The little Halstead. Always knew one of you would come sniffing back here. Blood calls to blood." Margaret's throat locked. The words landed like a curse. Daniel raised a hand slowly. "We're not armed. You shoot us, the evidence goes public. Our crew knows where we are." Carnes' pale eyes flicked toward Ryan, who had the camera half lifted. "That toy won't save you. Sheriff Claiborne already promised to clean up whatever mess you make. He's been cleaning for years." Margaret's voice broke. "Where is she? What have you done to Claire?" Carnes tilted his head. For a heartbeat, his expression almost softened, like a man amused by a child's question. "Claire, that's what you call her. She doesn't answer to that anymore. She's mine. She learned long ago family ain't blood. It's survival." Behind them, the chained figure whimpered, curling smaller. Margaret's heart split. Daniel edged closer, palms still raised. "You keep her alive, don't you? That's leverage. That's why you're careful. You kill us now, you lose your bargaining chip." Carnes's jaw flexed. "You think you know my rules. You don't know a damn thing." He took a step forward, boots grinding straw. The rifle barrel lowered, not away, but to Margaret's chest. "Your granddaddy started this. His ledger, his deals, his silence. And you came here thinking you could pull it all out by the roots. But roots run deep." Margaret's vision tunneled. She forced words past her shaking lips. "Jim Halstead. He wrote it all down because he knew it was wrong. And Thomas tried to stop you, didn't he? That's why he vanished." Something flickered in Carnes' face. A crack in the mask. Rage, quickly hidden. "Thomas never knew when to shut up," Carnes said finally. "Just like you." The rifle shifted, rising toward her face. Ryan lunged. Not toward Carnes, but sideways, yanking a heavy feed bucket from the wall and hurling it. The clang shattered the silence. Carnes flinched, the rifle jerking. Daniel seized the moment. He slammed into Carnes' shoulder, forcing the barrel toward the rafters. The rifle fired. A deafening crack that shook the barn, splinters raining from the roof. Margaret screamed. Carnes roared like an animal, shoving Daniel back with terrifying strength. The rifle swung low again. Daniel grappled with it, veins standing in his neck. Ryan dove forward, camera forgotten, clawing for Carnes's arm. The three men crashed against the stall, wood splintering under their weight. Margaret scrambled to the chained figure. Her cousin's eyes were wild, terrified. Margaret fumbled at the shackle, fingers bleeding against rust. "Hold on," she whispered frantically. "Just hold on." Behind her, the struggle raged. Carnes smashed Ryan in the ribs with the butt of the rifle, sending him sprawling. Daniel clung to the barrel, trying to twist it free. Carnes' breath came in guttural growls. 16 years I've fed her, he spat. Kept her alive when the rest rotted in the dirt. And you want to steal her? Margaret wrenched at the chain until her palms tore. The shackle bit deep into her cousin's ankle, blood seeping fresh. She screamed in frustration. Then, a sound. Sirens. Distant, rising. Carnes froze, head snapping toward the open door. For the first time, fear cracked his face. Daniel used the moment. He wrenched the rifle sideways, the barrel scraping across the floor. Carnes stumbled, lost his grip. The gun clattered out of reach. Ryan dragged it away, kicking it under a trough. Carnes' fury exploded. He swung a fist into Daniel's jaw, the crack echoing. Daniel fell hard. Margaret screamed again. But then the sirens grew louder, blue and red lights strobing faintly across the barn walls. Carnes bolted for the door. His boots thundered across the boards, vanishing into night. Margaret sobbed, clutching her cousin's hands. "We're here! We're here!" Outside, tires screeched. Voices shouted. Flashlights slashed the dark. Daniel staggered up, blood in his mouth, eyes blazing. "He's running." Ryan pressed a hand to his ribs, grimacing. "Let him. We've got her." Margaret held tighter to the trembling figure in chains. The girl's breath came in shallow bursts, her lips shaping a word. "Margaret." The voice was fragile, almost broken, but it was hers. "Claire." Margaret collapsed into tears. "Yes, it's me. You're safe now." The barn filled with police light. Deputies swarmed, shouting commands. But in Margaret's heart, only one truth pulsed. After 16 years, she had her cousin back, and Charles Carnes was finally running out of places to hide. The barn smelled of hay and gunpowder long after Carnes fled. Blue strobes painted the walls, and deputies barked orders over radios. Margaret barely heard them. She held Claire in her arms, rocking her gently, as though 16 years had not passed. Claire's skin was cold, her body so light it felt hollow. Her eyes fluttered, wide and distant, as if every movement of light or sound threatened to shatter her. But when Margaret whispered her name, Claire clutched her sleeve with skeletal fingers and did not let go. Paramedics worked quickly, cutting through the shackle with bolt cutters. The sound of snapping iron echoed like thunder. Claire whimpered and buried her face in Margaret's shoulder. Margaret kissed her hair, whispering, "It's over. It's over." Daniel stood close, his shirt streaked with blood from his split lip. He didn't speak, but his eyes stayed locked on Margaret, steadying her by sheer presence. Ryan sat slumped against a post, clutching his ribs, refusing treatment until Claire was loaded first. The deputies tried to ask questions, but Margaret could barely form words. "Take her," she begged. "Hospital, please." The ambulance swallowed Claire, doors slamming. Margaret climbed in beside her, never releasing her hand. The sirens wailed, carrying them away from the farm, the barn shrinking in the distance. But Margaret knew it wasn't over. Carnes was still out there. At the hospital, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, sharp and clinical after the darkness of the barn. Doctors swarmed Claire, their voices clipped and urgent. Severe malnutrition, old fractures, signs of prolonged captivity. Margaret sat in a plastic chair just outside the trauma bay, shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Doris arrived an hour later, her nightgown thrown under a coat, her hair unpinned. She fell into Margaret's arms with a sob, and for once neither woman had words, only the raw shock of reunion. When the doctors finally allowed them in, Claire was tucked under blankets, her eyes glassy but open. Doris's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, my baby girl." Claire blinked slowly, her lips forming a soundless word. "Grandma." Margaret thought her heart might break clean in half, but the reunion was jagged. Claire spoke little, her voice faint and broken, but when asked where she had been, her gaze went blank. "Don't make me say," she whispered once, shuddering violently. Margaret didn't push. Daniel returned from the sheriff's office with grim news. "They let Carnes slip," he said flatly. "Deputies claim he disappeared into the woods before they got there." Margaret's stomach twisted. "Or Claiborne let him go." Daniel didn't argue. His silence was enough. 2 days later, in a small conference room at the hospital, Detective Morales from Austin arrived with a box of files. She looked young, too young for such a heavy case, but her eyes were sharp. She spread photographs across the table, the ledger pages, Thomas's note, the footage of Claire stumbling from the barn. "Sheriff Claiborne has been obstructing for years," Morales said. "We've been building evidence quietly, but with your footage, and with Claire alive, we finally have leverage." Margaret's voice shook. "And Thomas?" "My uncle?" Morales hesitated. "We found remains near a sinkhole on Carnes' land. Dental records are being matched." Margaret closed her eyes. A piece of her had expected it, but hearing it aloud felt like a blade. "Why cover this up?" Daniel asked. Morales's gaze flicked to Margaret. "Because your grandfather made this county, and men like Carnes ensured it stayed in his image. Deals were struck, people disappeared. As long as Claiborne kept the peace, no one asked questions." Doris spoke for the first time, her voice brittle. "Peace bought with children's lives." No one answered. That night, Margaret sat alone in Claire's hospital room. The machines beeped steadily, the only sound in the sterile air. Claire slept fitfully, her thin hands clutching the blanket as though afraid it might be torn away. Margaret whispered into the silence. Words for both of them. "I'll keep you safe now. No one will take you again." She believed it, yet outside the window, rain lashed the glass, and in her mind she saw Carnes's eyes, pale, cold, unfinished. Because somewhere beyond these walls, Charles Carnes was still breathing, and Margaret knew he would come back. The news broke within hours. "Missing cousin found alive after 16 years in captivity." The headline ran across every channel, every feed. Old photographs of Claire, bright-eyed at 12, were plastered beside grainy footage from the barn. For once, the nation's gaze turned toward a sleepy Texas county that had hidden its secrets too well. Reporters descended on the hospital. Margaret glimpsed them from the windows, their cameras flashing against the glass. She kept the curtains closed. The world might call it a miracle, but she knew better. Miracles didn't leave scars that deep. Claire remained fragile, her body healing slowly, her mind slower still. Some days she spoke, broken phrases, fragments of memory. Other days she curled inward, unreachable, her eyes fixed on some place only she could see. Margaret stayed at her bedside, Doris too, always nearby, humming the lullabies she had sung when the girls were children. The family, fractured for so long, sat together again, though pieces were missing, pieces that could never be replaced. Detective Morales visited often, updates in hand. Sheriff Claiborne resigned for health reasons under mounting scrutiny. The ledger was in federal custody now, its pages a roadmap of corruption. Arrests rippled outward like cracks in glass. Businessmen, deputies, men who had built their reputations on silence, but not Carnes. He remained absent. Hunters combed the woods, drones scanned the hills, bloodhounds traced trails that dissolved into creeks and stone. He had lived off the grid before. He could do it again. Margaret walked hospital corridors at night, her footsteps echoing, unable to sleep. Sometimes she thought she saw him reflected in the glass doors, broad shoulders, pale eyes. Each time her breath caught, and each time it was nothing. Yet the fear lingered. On the fifth night, Claire stirred awake. Her voice was faint, ragged, but steady enough to cut through the dark. "He said he'll come back." Margaret froze. "Who?" Claire's eyes met hers, hollow but certain. "The man with the pale eyes. He said he always comes back." Margaret's throat closed. She forced herself to nod, stroking her cousin's hair. "Not this time. I won't let him." But as she sat there, listening to the storm batter the windows, Margaret knew the truth she could never say aloud. Charles Carnes was still out there, and somewhere in the shadows of the county that had fed him for decades, he was already watching. The screen fades to black. A final line of text appears. "Charles Carnes remains at large. The investigation into the Halstead family ledger is ongoing."